All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about, several other systems and how they develop in fetal life. We spent a little more time on cardiovascular, respiratory, GI. Now we're going to talk about some others, but it'll be a little bit quicker. The hepatic system, the liver and the biliary tract are formed during week 4. Hematopoiesis, which is making blood cells, begins in week 6. Remember that the bone marrow is not really going and making blood cells until around week 11. So the liver starts with some of that. The liver is large in relation to the body. Bile is produced from about 12 weeks. Glycogen stores from around 9 weeks. Iron is stored in the liver. So if the fetus gets to full term, then the iron stores that have been, the iron that's been stored in the liver will last around 5 months. If an infant is born preterm, they've had less time to store iron, so they're more likely to develop anemia earlier. The liver does not conjugate bilirubin in fetal life. I know that Ms. Durant has talked about the liver a little bit and conjugating bilirubin, but it doesn't do that in fetal life. Okay, that's important because when we get to extrauterine life, then the infant has to be into conjugate bilirubin. There are several coagulation factors that are not produced in fetal life because of the lack of vitamin K. Vitamin K is essential to forming some of the coagulation factors in the clotting cascade. So vitamin K is produced by normal gut flora, but the fetal gut doesn't have those flora yet. The fetal gut is actually sterile, near sterile until after birth. With the first feeding, then that the gut is colonized and can begin to make some vitamin K. Renal system. The kidneys form around week 5, start to function about week 9. Urine is excreted. And in the fetal part of this, the last 2 trimesters, it forms the majority of amniotic fluid. The fetus can survive in utero without functioning kidneys. The kidneys function, but they don't have to function because remember that excretory function is performed by the placenta. So we might see that the fetus has poorly functioning or non-functioning kidneys or no kidneys in utero, but the fetus is not going to have any negative effects from that until after birth. Okay. The neurologic system forms in the 3rd week, forms from the ectoderm. In the 4th week, an open neural tube forms, so really early in gestation. The neural tube closes first at where the brain and spinal cord will meet, the junction of the brain and spinal cord, and both ends are open. Okay, when the embryo folds in, a fold occurs at that time that's going to become the head. Okay, the cranial end of the neural tube closes first, so that's the head end, and then the caudal end closes. So the neural tube closes in the middle. When the folding in happens, the embryo folds in, the head is part of that fold, and then the cranial end of that neural tube closes, and then the caudal end. So around week 5, the brain begins to divide into differentiated tissues. From week 8, brain waves are detected. They're very rudimentary, but they're there. The spinal cord develops, and then the peripheral nervous system. So again, development is cephalocaudal, proximodistal. Respiratory movements, extremity movements, and position changes begin by around week 11 or 12. Neurologic development is not complete at birth. It continues after birth. By around 24 weeks, the fetus responds to sound externally. They also will respond to light that shined on the mother's abdomen. They can see some light through the abdominal and uterine wall. They can distinguish taste by the 5th month, and they've actually determined that by adding different tastes to the amniotic fluid. The mother's food actually does, whatever the mother ingests actually does affect the flavor of amniotic fluid. So if the mother's eating a variety of foods, there's a theory that the child gets used to a greater variety of taste. But that we do know that when amniotic fluid is sweeter, they drink more of it. The endocrine system, the thyroid gland is actually formed during weeks 3 to 4, and by week 8, the fetus is, or the embryo is producing thyroxine. The adrenal cortex is formed during the 6th week, and hormones begin by week 8 or 9. The pancreas is formed by week 5 to 8. By week 20, the fetus is actually producing insulin. The reproductive system, until week 9, genitals are indistinguishable. You cannot determine visually what genitals will actually form. Sex differentiation begins about week 7. It's complete around week 12, so you can actually visually tell the difference around week 12. You should know that male and female fetuses actually have analogous organs. So the same organs are present in the embryo, and then they change based on hormone exposure at that particular point in development. Most commonly, fetuses with XX chromosomes develop female genitals. Fetuses with XY chromosomes develop male genitals. But that's not always 100% the case. There are cases in which the chromosome and the physical genitals are different, and that's going to have to do with hormone exposure during that critical time period. And there are times when the genitals are not immediately identifiable as either male or female at birth. And those individuals identify as intersex. There's been a lot of controversy. Historically, a long time ago, it was believed that families needed to make a decision and have that child surgically identified as either male or female as early as possible, and raise the child and socialize them to the chosen gender. What happened is that sometimes they chose incorrectly, and so a child would be selected by the parents, and that choice was often based on the organs that were present, what would seem to be the easiest or the least complicated way to do surgical corrections or surgical changes. So there were times that was done, and then around preschool years, when children develop a gender identity, they actually would identify as the other gender, and so there was a lot of confusion and challenge with that. And so the recommendation now for babies that are born intersex is not to do any alteration. They're going to go ahead and do chromosome and hormone studies and try to determine if the chromosomal sex matches the physical sex, but also to wait and allow that child to self-identify gender, usually around 3 years old or so. Okay. And that kind of puts a different twist on the transgender discussion, because a lot of times that's been presented as someone who is physically absolutely one sex and they identify as another gender, but there's actually been some studies that show a pretty significant number of people are intersex, but we're not aware of it because their physical reproductive organs externally appear clearly to be one sex or the other, but that doesn't necessarily match their chromosomal sex. So there's more variation there than we were previously aware of. The musculoskeletal system, around week 4, bones and muscles begin to form. Vertebral bones grow toward each other and enclose the developing spinal cord. So as the spinal cord develops, we also have the bones of the spine forming and closing around the spinal cord to protect it. The bones of the skull are actually formed in the embryonic period, very early. Shoulders, arms, hips, and legs are formed by week 6, and the bones begin to separate. Integumentary system. The epidermis begins as a single layer of cells about 4 weeks. By 7 weeks, there are 2 layers. By 17 weeks, there is identifiable skin. It's thin, wrinkled. Blood vessels are visible through the skin. And then as the fetus continues to develop, the skin thickens. After 32 weeks, the fetus starts to develop some subcutaneous fat. By 16 weeks, the epidermal ridges form, so we can see handprints and footprints. Lenugo is a fine, really fine body hair, and it covers the body by sometime around 20 weeks. So earlier than that, you're not going to see much, and then it gets thicker and thicker, and then it starts to thin and be rubbed off as delivery nears. So we can look at the amount of Lenugo and get some idea of development. Eyebrows, lashes, and scalp hair begin to grow in the second, third trimester also. Around 28 weeks, that Lenugo starts to get thinner and disappear. It's kind of rubbed off, and scalp hair is growing. Fingernails and toenails start growing around 10 weeks. The immunologic system. Maternal antibodies cross the placenta. So that's going to provide protection to the fetus from some infections, but also remember that if fetal blood gets into the maternal bloodstream and the blood types are not compatible, if the maternal blood forms antibodies against the fetal blood cells, those antibodies do cross the placenta and go into the fetal bloodstream, so they can attack the fetal blood cells. IgM is produced by the end of the first trimester. IgA is not produced all in fetal life, but colostrum has a lot of it. So the immune system is not mature even at birth, but it continues to mature over the first years of life. All right, the next section, we're going to talk about multi-fetal pregnancies.